The crack of a rifle split the still desert air as the final target, a rusty tin can perched precariously on a fence post nearly 100 yards away, flew backward with a metallic ping. Mackenzie O'Brien lowered her Winchester, a satisfied smile playing on her lips as she watched the men's jaws drop one by one. It wasn't the first time she'd silenced a crowd of cowboys with her marksmanship, but here in Dry Creek, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1878, it seemed the locals needed a special demonstration. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered the saloon keeper, a portly man with a handlebar mustache who had bet $5 she wouldn't hit more than 3 targets. Mackenzie blew a stray copper-colored curl from her face and turned to him with an outstretched palm. "I believe that's $20, Mr. Jenkins." The crowd of dusty, sun-weathered men shuffled uncomfortably. Some chuckled nervously, others looked downright insulted. It wasn't proper for a woman to outshoot men, especially not one who stood barely 5'4" in her worn leather boots, with freckles scattered across her nose like cinnamon on cream. "Might have been luck," called a voice from the back of the group. Mackenzie slid the rifle into its scabbard on her saddle. "Set him up again, and I'll do it blindfolded next time," she replied, not bothering to hide the edge in her voice. At 26, she'd spent too many years proving herself to care much about wounded male pride. A tall figure pushed through the crowd, then a man she hadn't noticed before. Unlike the others in their worn cotton shirts and dusty trousers, he wore a crisp black vest over a white shirt, though his boots showed the miles of hard travel. His dark hat shadowed piercing blue eyes that assessed her with unsettling directness. "No need for another demonstration," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "The lady shot better than any man here. I'd say that settles it." Jenkins reluctantly counted out the money and pressed it into Mackenzie's palm. The crowd began to disperse, muttering about luck and trick shots, but the stranger remained, studying her with undisguised interest. "Kieran Zachary," he said, extending a hand. "I run cattle about 30 miles north of here." Mackenzie hesitated before shaking his hand. "Mackenzie O'Brien, I saw the way you handled that Winchester." His eyes flickered to the rifle. "Been looking for someone with skills like yours." She'd heard lines like this before, usually followed by propositions that had nothing to do with her shooting abilities. Her guard went up immediately. "I'm not interested in being anybody's saloon entertainment, Mr. Zachary." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Good, because I'm not offering that. I need a partner who can shoot, someone to help me drive a herd to Fort Whipple. The Cavendish gang has been hitting cattle drives hard this season." "A partner?" Mackenzie raised an eyebrow. "Not a hired hand," Kieran clarified. "An equal share in the profits." "I need someone I can trust at my back." She studied him warily. Men didn't offer partnerships to women, especially not women like her, the daughter of an Irish immigrant and a Mexican mother, with no family name to speak of since both had died of fever when she was 16. She'd survived by the skills they'd taught her, her father's way with a gun and horses, her mother's stubborn determination. "Why me?" she asked bluntly. Kieran's gaze was steady. "Because you shoot better than anyone I've seen in 3 territories, and I need someone who won't miss if trouble comes calling. I don't much care if you wear trousers or a dress while you do it." A few of the lingering onlookers snickered. Mackenzie ignored them, considering his offer. She'd been drifting for months, taking odd jobs where she could find them guarding shipments, hunting game for mining camps, occasionally breaking horses. A partnership would mean steady work, at least for a while. "When do you need an answer?" she asked. "I'm heading back tomorrow at first light." "The herd needs to be in Fort Whipple by the end of the month." Mackenzie nodded slowly. "I'll think on it." The boarding house where Mackenzie had taken a room was a simple 2-story clapboard structure, clean but worn around the edges like everything else in Dry Creek. She sat on the narrow bed that night, cleaning her rifle while she contemplated Kieran Zachary's offer. She'd learned to be cautious around men with proposals. Too many had turned sour, with the men expecting her to become a wife or a mistress once the business was concluded. But there had been something straightforward in Zachary's eyes, something that suggested he was exactly what he claimed to be, a rancher who needed a good shot at his side. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss O'Brien." It was the boarding house owner's wife, Mrs. Turner. "There's a gentleman asking to speak with you downstairs." Mackenzie slid her pistol into the holster at her hip before following Mrs. Turner down to the small parlor. To her surprise, it was Kieran Zachary waiting for her, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Zachary." "I didn't expect to see you until morning. I thought you might want more details before making your decision," he said. "May I?" He gestured to the small table in the corner. Once they were seated, he laid out the facts plainly. 300 head of cattle to be driven north to Fort Whipple, where the Army was paying top dollar. 10 days of hard riding through territory known for bandits and occasional Apache raids. If they succeeded, the profit would be substantial enough for Mackenzie to live comfortably for half a year or more. "I should mention," he added, "the reason I'm offering a partnership instead of hiring guns is because I've tried that route. Last drive, 2 of my hired men turned out to be working with the Cavendish gang. I lost a third of my herd and nearly my life." Mackenzie's brow furrowed. "So you're trusting a woman you just met today?" "I'm trusting the look in your eyes when you were shooting," he replied. "A person can fake a lot of things, Miss O'Brien, but not the focus I saw there. That comes from depending on your skills to survive." He paused, studying her. "Am I wrong?" She couldn't deny it. After her parents died, that rifle had been the difference between eating and starving more times than she could count. "You're not wrong," she admitted. "But you should know something. I work as an equal. I don't take orders well, and I won't be treated like property to be directed." Kieran leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That's exactly what I'm looking for, Miss O'Brien. A partner, not property, someone who can think for themselves and act without waiting to be told what to do. And after the drive, what then?" "That depends on how well we work together," he said honestly. "I have more cattle to move before winter. If this arrangement suits us both, I'd be interested in continuing it." Mackenzie considered this. It was more opportunity than she'd been offered in a long time. And something about Kieran Zachary's direct manner appealed to her. There were no false promises in his proposition. "All right, Mr. Zachary," she said finally, "you have yourself a partner." His face broke into a genuine smile, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made Mackenzie's heart skip unexpectedly. "Call me Kieran," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Partners use first names." "Mackenzie, then," she replied, taking his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing the handshake of a man who didn't feel the need to prove his strength. Another point in his favor, she thought. "We leave at dawn," he said, rising. "Pack light but bring plenty of ammunition. With luck, we won't need it, but—" "This is the Arizona Territory," Mackenzie finished for him. "Luck isn't something to count on." "Precisely." Kieran settled his hat back on his head. "Good night, Mackenzie. I'll meet you at the livery." After he left, Mackenzie returned to her room and finished packing her few possessions. As she worked, she wondered if she was making a mistake trusting this man she barely knew. But the alternative was to continue drifting, taking whatever work came her way, always alone, for better or worse. She'd cast her lot with Kieran Zachary. At least the next few weeks promised to be interesting. Dawn was just breaking when Mackenzie arrived at the livery stable, her saddlebags packed and her weapons cleaned and loaded. She wore practical riding clothes, sturdy trousers, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest that had belonged to her father. Her wide-brimmed hat kept the early morning sun from her eyes as she checked her horse, a sturdy paint mare she'd named Whiskey for her tawny coloring. Kieran was already there, saddling a handsome black stallion. He nodded approvingly at her punctuality. "The herd's camped about 5 miles north," he explained as they rode out of town. "I've got 2 men watching them, brothers named Hank and Luther Miller, good hands with cattle, though they might be surprised to see you." "They won't be the first," Mackenzie replied dryly. Kieran glanced at her. "Fair warning, Hank can be a bit old-fashioned in his thinking, but he follows my lead and I won't tolerate any disrespect toward you." "I can handle my own battles, Kieran," he nodded. I don't doubt it, just setting expectations. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the desert landscape gradually waking around them. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the reddening sky, and the air was filled with the calls of early morning birds. "How did you come to be so skilled with a rifle?" Kieran asked eventually. Mackenzie hesitated, unused to sharing her history, but if they were to be partners, he deserved some measure of truth. "My father taught me," she said. "He fought in the war the Union side, said a person never knows when they might need to defend themselves, boy or girl." She adjusted her hat. "After my parents died, I found out how right he was." Kieran nodded, not pressing for more details. "My father was a Confederate officer," he said instead. "Came west after the war with nothing but his horse and his pride, built a small ranch, married my mother, had me and my sister. Both gone now." "I'm sorry," Mackenzie said, recognizing the familiar shadow of loss in his voice. "It was years ago." Kieran's eyes scanned the horizon, ever alert. "The ranch is mine now, not the biggest spread, but it's good land. The cattle drive profits should help me expand it." They crested a small rise, and Mackenzie saw the herd spread out in a natural basin below several hundred head of longhorn cattle, their coats catching the morning sun. Two men on horseback moved among them, their shapes small in the distance. "There they are," Kieran said with obvious pride. 300 head of the finest cattle in the territory. As they approached, Mackenzie felt the familiar tension of being assessed. The Miller brothers watched her with undisguised curiosity as Kieran made introductions. Hank, the older one, didn't bother to hide his skepticism. "A woman." He said bluntly to Kieran, "This is your solution. Miss O'Brien is the finest shot I've seen in 3 territories," Kieran replied evenly. "And she's my partner on this drive. You have a problem with that, you can collect your pay now and head back to town." Hank's weathered face registered surprise, then grudging acceptance. "Your herd boss, just hope she can handle herself if trouble comes." "I can handle myself just fine, Mr. Miller," Mackenzie said coolly, "and I'd be happy to demonstrate if you're not convinced." Luther, the younger brother, grinned unexpectedly. "No need for that, madam. If Kieran says you can shoot, that's good enough. Besides, anyone who can shut up the whole saloon like you did yesterday is someone I want on my side." With that matter settled, they began the drive. Mackenzie quickly proved her worth, not just with her shooting, but with her skill on horseback. She'd worked cattle before, and while she didn't have the Miller brothers' years of experience, she was a quick study and fearless when it came to heading off strays or calming startled animals. By the end of the first day, even Hank had stopped watching her with suspicion and instead began treating her with the same gruff respect he showed Kieran. They made camp as the sun was setting, and after the cattle were settled, Luther volunteered to cook while the others set up the camp. Mackenzie found herself working alongside Kieran, unloading supplies from the pack horse. "You did well today," he commented, handing her a canvas bag of coffee. "The Millers don't impress easily." "I didn't come along to impress anyone," she replied, though she couldn't help feeling a small surge of satisfaction. "But thank you." "I know why you came," Kieran said with unexpected seriousness. "Same reason I asked you. We're both trying to build something that's ours." He paused, looking out at the cattle herd. "Not many get that chance, especially out here." Mackenzie studied him in the fading light, seeing the determination in his profile. For the first time, she wondered what it might be like to have a permanent partner in life's endeavors, not just a temporary business arrangement. The thought startled her, and she quickly pushed it aside. "I'll take first watch," she said, changing the subject. "Wake me in 4 hours for the second." Kieran nodded. "I'll spell you then." Later, as she sat by the small fire with her rifle across her lap, Mackenzie watched the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. The cattle were quiet, just occasional lowing or the sound of them shifting in their sleep. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the desert. She glanced over to where Kieran slept, his hat pulled low over his face. There was something about him that intrigued her, a steadiness she hadn't often encountered in her years of drifting. He seemed like a man who knew his own mind and wasn't threatened by a woman who knew hers. Dangerous thoughts for someone who'd learned early that depending on others was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet as the night deepened around her, Mackenzie found herself wondering what it might be like to trust someone completely again, not just with her life, but with her heart. The first 3 days of the cattle drive passed without incident. They settled into a rhythm, up before dawn, moving the herd through the cool morning hours, resting during the worst of the midday heat, then pushing on until dusk. The cattle were well behaved for the most part, though there were always a few troublemakers that needed special attention. Mackenzie found herself working closely with Kieran, learning his signals and commands without the need for words. There was an efficiency to his movements that she appreciated, a lack of wasted effort that matched her own practical nature. By the third evening, they had developed a partnership that felt almost telepathic. She could anticipate his needs before he voiced them, and he seemed to have the same intuition about her. It was during the 4th day that trouble first appeared on the horizon. They had been pushing the herd through a narrow valley, rocky outcroppings rising on either side. Mackenzie, riding point, felt a prickle of unease. The terrain was perfect for an ambush. She signaled to Kieran, who nodded and immediately redirected the herd toward more open ground. They had almost cleared the valley when 3 riders appeared, blocking their path. 3 more materialized behind them, effectively trapping the herd. Cavendish men, Hank muttered, riding up beside Kieran and Mackenzie. Kieran's face hardened. Mackenzie, hang back, let me talk to them first. She frowned. That wasn't our agreement. Partners, remember? He gave her a sharp look, then nodded reluctantly. Stay alert, these men don't play fair. Together they rode forward to meet the riders. The man in the center, clearly the leader, was a broad-shouldered figure with a red bandana around his neck and a week's worth of stubble on his face. Zachary, he called, a false friendliness in his voice. Fancy meeting you here. Wade, Kieran replied coldly. You're a long way from your usual territory. The man called Wade grinned, revealing a gold tooth. Business is expanding, and speaking of business. His eyes moved to the cattle, then to Mackenzie, widening slightly in surprise. Who's your new friend? My partner, Kieran said, a hint of steel in his voice. Wade's eyebrows rose. Partner, huh, times are changing. He tipped his hat mockingly to Mackenzie. Madam. She didn't bother acknowledging the greeting, keeping her hand casually near her pistol instead. What do you want, Wade? Kieran asked bluntly, same as always. A reasonable tax for safe passage through this territory, let's say 30 head. This isn't your territory, Kieran replied, and we're not paying any tax. Wade's friendly demeanor evaporated. That's not how this works, Zachary. You remember what happened last time you decided to be difficult. His hand drifted toward his gun. Only this time I won't leave any survivors to tell the tale. Mackenzie had been watching the other riders carefully. One of them, positioned to their right, had been slowly maneuvering his horse to gain a better angle on Kieran. As the man's hand moved to his holster, Mackenzie drew and fired in one fluid motion. The shot cracked across the valley. The man's pistol went flying from his hand, and he clutched his bleeding fingers with a howl of pain. Wade's eyes widened, his own draw interrupted by the unexpected shot. Mackenzie shifted her aim slightly, the barrel of her pistol now pointing directly at his chest. Next one won't be so considerate, she said calmly. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Wade began to laugh, a raspy sound that held no humor. Well now, Zachary, I see why you called her a partner. He raised his hands slowly. Seems we have a misunderstanding here. We'll just be on our way for now. That would be wise, Kieran agreed, his own pistol now drawn and steady. And Wade, don't follow us. This drive is off limits to you and your men. Wade's eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. He and his men backed their horses away slowly, never turning their backs. Once they had retreated a fair distance, they wheeled their mounts and galloped away, disappearing into the rugged landscape. Kieran turned to Mackenzie, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. That was a hell of a shot. He was drawing on you, she said simply. I know, thank you. He glanced in the direction the riders had gone. But this isn't over. Wade Thornton doesn't give up that easily. He'll be back, probably with more men. Mackenzie holstered her pistol. Then we'll be ready. They rejoined Hank and Luther, who had been keeping the herd from scattering during the confrontation. Luther whistled low when they explained what had happened. "Never seen anyone outdraw Pete Rollins before," he said, looking at Mackenzie with newfound respect. "Man's supposed to be lightning fast." "Not fast enough," Hank grunted, but there was approval in his eyes too. They pushed the herd hard for the rest of the day, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the Cavendish gang. By nightfall, they had reached a defensible position, a natural basin with a creek running through it, surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would make it difficult for anyone to approach unseen. As they set up camp, Kieran pulled Mackenzie aside. "I want to apologize for trying to keep you back," he said quietly. "Old habits, it won't happen again." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "See that it doesn't. I didn't sign on to be protected, Kieran." "No," he agreed, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You signed on to be a partner, and I'd say you've more than proven yourself today." Later, as they sat around the campfire after dinner, Luther regaled them with stories of previous cattle drives and the characters he'd known over the years. Mackenzie found herself laughing more than she had in months, the tension of the day's confrontation gradually easing from her shoulders. She noticed Kieran watching her across the fire, his blue eyes reflective in the dancing light. When their gazes met, he didn't look away, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the bond that was forming. Not just the partnership they'd agreed to, but something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Mackenzie was the first to break eye contact, suddenly uneasy with the direction of her thoughts. She volunteered for the first watch again and moved away from the fire to take up her position. The night was clear, with a 3/4 moon illuminating the landscape in silver. The cattle were settled, and only the occasional night bird broke the silence. Mackenzie found herself thinking about the day's events, replaying the confrontation in her mind. She'd reacted instinctively to protect Kieran, without a moment's hesitation or doubt. It had been a long time since she'd felt that kind of loyalty to anyone. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Kieran approach until he spoke. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, settling beside her on the rock where she sat. "Just thinking about today," she admitted. "Those men won't give up so easily." "No, they won't." Kieran stretched his long legs out in front of him. "But neither will we." He glanced at her. "You know, when I asked you to partner with me, I thought I was hiring a good shot. I didn't realize I was getting a fearless gunslinger in the bargain." Mackenzie chuckled despite herself. "Hardly a gunslinger, just someone who's learned to react quickly. The hard way, I imagine." She nodded, memories surfacing her first year alone after her parents died. The men who had thought a solitary girl would be easy prey. The lessons she'd learned in blood and fear before she'd become someone others hesitated to cross. "My father taught me to shoot," she said after a long pause, "but life taught me when to pull the trigger." She looked at him curiously. "What about you? You handle yourself well enough." Kieran's expression grew distant. "My father believed in being prepared. After the war, he never fully trusted that peace would last. He made sure I knew how to defend myself and what was mine." He sighed. "He died thinking another civil conflict was inevitable. Sometimes I wonder if he was right." "The war's been over for 13 years, Mackenzie pointed out. "The fighting stopped," Kieran corrected her, "but the wounds it left, those are still raw in many places." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Kieran spoke again, his voice quieter. "I've been thinking about what happens after this drive." Mackenzie tensed slightly. "We agreed to take it one drive at a time." "We did," he acknowledged. "But I'm wondering if you might consider something more permanent. The ranch needs someone who can handle themselves, someone who thinks on their feet." He hesitated. "Someone like you." "You're offering me a job?" she asked, careful to keep her voice neutral. "I'm offering you a home base," he clarified. "A place to belong if you want it. Still as a partner, not an employee. You could come and go as you please, but you'd always have somewhere to return to." The offer took Mackenzie by surprise. In her years of drifting, no one had ever suggested such an arrangement, a place that could be hers without demands or expectations attached. "Why?" she asked finally. "You barely know me." Kieran looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. "I know enough. I know you're capable, loyal, and brave. I know you keep your word. Out here, that's more than most people ever learn about those they depend on." She wanted to believe him that his offer was as straightforward as it sounded, but experience had taught her caution. "And what would you expect in return?" she asked bluntly. He seemed to understand the real question behind her words. "Your skills, your partnership in running the ranch, nothing more than what you're willing to give, Mackenzie. I'm not in the habit of making demands on people's hearts or bodies." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in her chest at his answer. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Kieran nodded and stood, apparently satisfied with her response. "That's all I ask. I should let you get back to your watch." As he walked back toward the camp, Mackenzie found herself watching him go, wondering what it might be like to stop running, to have a place and perhaps a person to call home. The next 3 days passed without sign of the Cavendish gang, but none of them believed the threat had passed. They maintained vigilant watches and kept the herd moving at a steady pace. The terrain gradually changed as they headed north, the desert giving way to more varied landscapes with patches of scrub forest and rolling hills. On the afternoon of the 8th day, they were forced to cross a wide river. The water was high from recent rains upstream, making the crossing treacherous. It took hours to get the entire herd across, with all 4 of them working tirelessly to prevent any cattle from being swept downstream. By the time the last steer made it safely to the opposite bank, they were all soaked and exhausted. They made camp early, building a larger fire than usual to dry their clothes and warm their chilled bodies. "Another day like this and I might consider a different line of work," Luther joked as he wrung water from his shirt. Hank snorted. "You've been saying that for 15 years, little brother." "Well, one of these days I might mean it," Luther replied good-naturedly. Mackenzie smiled, watching the brothers' familiar banter. Over the past week, she had come to appreciate their steady presence, Hank's gruff reliability, and Luther's quick humor. They treated her with respect now, as a fellow drover rather than an oddity or a burden. Kieran emerged from checking on the herd, his clothes still damp but his spirits apparently undiminished. "Everyone all right?" he asked, settling by the fire. "Just fine, now that we're not swimming with the cattle," Mackenzie replied. She passed him a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the hot drink. Their eyes met over the rim of the cup, and Mackenzie knew he had felt it too, that growing awareness between them that went beyond their business arrangement. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The spell was broken by Hank calling from the other side of the fire. "How far to Fort Whipple now, boss?" Kieran cleared his throat, turning his attention to the question. 2, maybe 3 days if the weather holds and we don't have any more river crossings like today's." "And if the Cavendish boys stay off our trail," Luther added, his usual smile dimming slightly. "We'll handle them if they show," Kieran said confidently. That night, Mackenzie took the second watch. The events of the day had left her too tired to volunteer for the first shift as she usually did. When Luther woke her, the camp was quiet, with only the soft snores of the men and the occasional sounds from the cattle breaking the silence. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making the night darker than previous ones. Mackenzie moved to a small rise that offered a good vantage point and settled in, her rifle across her knees. The river gurgled in the distance, a constant murmur that almost lulled her back to sleep. She was struggling to keep her eyes open when a faint sound caught her attention, the distinctive clink of metal against metal. Instantly alert, she strained to locate the source of the noise. There it was again, coming from the eastern edge of the camp. Mackenzie rose silently, moving like a shadow toward the sound. As she crept closer, she could make out dark figures moving among the cattle, at least 4 men, working quietly to separate a portion of the herd. Rustlers, or more likely, the Cavendish gang making good on their threat. Either way, they needed to be stopped. Mackenzie slipped back to camp, moving first to where Kieran slept. She placed a hand over his mouth to prevent any startled exclamation as she woke him, then whispered the situation in his ear. He nodded, immediately alert, and moved to wake the Miller brothers while Mackenzie returned to watch the rustlers. Within minutes, all four of them were in position, surrounding the men who were attempting to drive off about 50 head of cattle. Kieran's voice rang out in the darkness. "That's far enough, Wade." The rustlers froze, then scattered for cover. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, muzzle flashes illuminating the night in brief, blinding bursts. The cattle, startled by the noise, began to move restlessly, threatening to stampede. Mackenzie took careful aim at a figure crouching behind a boulder and fired. The man cried out and fell back. She ducked as return fire kicked up dirt near her position, then moved quickly to a new spot, never staying in one place long enough to become an easy target. Through the chaos, she caught glimpses of Kieran and the Miller brothers, each holding their own against the attackers. The firefight seemed to stretch endlessly, though in reality it probably lasted less than 5 minutes. Then, abruptly, the rustlers began to retreat. Mackenzie heard Wade Thornton's voice calling his men back. As they mounted their horses and prepared to flee, she took careful aim at Wade himself, visible for a moment as he swung onto his horse. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but she didn't fire. Shooting a man in the back, even one like Wade, wasn't something she could bring herself to do. Instead, she fired into the air, a warning shot that accelerated the rustlers' departure. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, they regrouped at the camp. Hank had a graze on his arm, and Luther was limping slightly from a fall he'd taken diving for cover, but otherwise they were unharmed. "Everyone all right?" Kieran asked, his eyes immediately seeking out Mackenzie. She nodded. "Fine, they got away, though." "But without any of our cattle," he pointed out. "That's what matters. And I don't think they'll be back, not on this drive anyway. Wade doesn't like losing, and he's lost twice now." They spent the rest of the night calming the herd and keeping watch in pairs, unwilling to risk another surprise attack. Mackenzie found herself partnered with Kieran, sitting side by side as the eastern sky gradually lightened with the approach of dawn. "I saw you take aim at Wade," Kieran said quietly. "Why didn't you take the shot?" Mackenzie was silent for a moment, considering her answer. "He was running away. The threat was over." Kieran nodded slowly. "Many would have taken that shot. It would have ended the problem permanently." "Maybe," she acknowledged, "or maybe it would have started a blood feud with whatever family or friends he has. Violence has a way of creating more violence." She glanced at him. "Does that disappoint you?" "No," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It confirms what I already knew about you, Mackenzie O'Brien. You're not just good with a gun, you know when not to use it. That's rarer than you might think." The sun was cresting the horizon now, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rose. In the gentle morning light, Mackenzie could see the fatigue etched on Kieran's face and something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "We should get the herd moving," she said, breaking the moment before it could deepen into something she wasn't ready to face. "The sooner we reach Fort Whipple, the better." Kieran's eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer, then he nodded and rose to his feet. "You're right. Let's wake the others." As predicted, they reached Fort Whipple on the afternoon of the 10th day. The Army quartermaster was expecting them, and the transaction went smoothly. The agreed-upon price was paid in full, with a bonus for the excellent condition of the cattle despite the long journey. That evening, the four of them celebrated in the fort's small tavern, enjoying real food and comfortable chairs for the first time in days. The Miller brothers were in high spirits, already making plans for how to spend their shares of the profits. "I'm thinking of buying that piece of land south of Prescott," Luther announced. "The one with the creek running through it. Might try my hand at raising horses instead of chasing cows across the territory." "You," Hank scoffed, "a horse breeder, you can barely stay on one." "That's not true and you know it," Luther protested. "I just had bad luck with that buckskin last spring." Mackenzie laughed along with them, but her mind was elsewhere. Now that the drive was over, she needed to decide what came next. Kieran hadn't mentioned his offer again since that night by the fire, but she could feel it hanging between them, unresolved. As if reading her thoughts, Kieran leaned closer to her, speaking quietly so the brothers couldn't hear. "Have you given any more thought to my proposition?" She met his gaze steadily. "I have." And Mackenzie hesitated. The logical part of her said to refuse, to maintain her independence and freedom. But another part, a part she'd almost forgotten existed, longed for the stability he was offering, for the chance to belong somewhere, with someone who respected her skills and her autonomy. "I'd like to see this ranch of yours first," she said finally, "before I decide." Kieran's face brightened with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "That's fair. We can head there tomorrow if you like. It's only a day's ride from here." Later that night, alone in her room at the fort's guest quarters, Mackenzie questioned her decision. Was she truly considering settling in one place after years of constant movement? And what about Kieran himself? She couldn't deny the attraction she felt toward him, the way her pulse quickened when their eyes met or their hands touched. But she'd learned early that such feelings were dangerous. They clouded judgment and created vulnerabilities she couldn't afford. Yet something about him was different from other men she'd known. His offer of partnership, his respect for her abilities, his willingness to treat her as an equal, these weren't things she'd encountered often in her travels. As she drifted toward sleep, Mackenzie found herself both anticipating and dreading the journey to Kieran's ranch. Tomorrow would bring her one step closer to a decision that could change the course of her life. The next morning dawned clear and cool. After saying goodbye to the Miller brothers, who were heading back to their own homes near Dry Creek, Mackenzie and Kieran set out for his ranch. The landscape grew more verdant as they traveled northward, leaving the harsher desert terrain behind for rolling grasslands interspersed with stands of pine and oak. By mid-afternoon, Kieran pointed to a distant ridge. "Just beyond there, that's Whispering Pines Ranch." As they crested the ridge, Mackenzie caught her breath. Below them stretched a beautiful valley, a clear stream winding through its center. A modest but well-maintained ranch house stood near a cluster of outbuildings, with corrals and a small barn nearby. Cattle grazed peacefully in the lush pastures, and horses moved about in a fenced meadow. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Pride was evident in Kieran's voice as he replied, "My father chose this land for the water and good grass. He always said it was the prettiest spot in the territory." They rode down into the valley, and as they approached the ranch house, a young woman emerged from the door, waving enthusiastically. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with Kieran's dark hair and blue eyes. "Kieran," she called, running to meet them, "you're back early." He swung down from his horse and embraced the young woman warmly. "The drive went faster than expected," he said, then turned to Mackenzie. "This is my sister, Emily. This is Mackenzie O'Brien, my partner on the cattle drive." Emily's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but her smile remained genuine as she extended her hand to Mackenzie. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss O'Brien. Kieran doesn't usually bring business associates home. Please call me Mackenzie," she replied, taking the offered hand. "And I'm here to see the ranch. Your brother has offered me a more permanent partnership." Emily's eyebrows rose even higher at this, and she shot her brother a questioning look that Mackenzie couldn't quite interpret. "Well then, we'd better show you around properly," she said after a moment. "But first, come inside. You must be tired after your journey." The interior of the ranch house was as impressive as its setting, clean, comfortable, and surprisingly refined for a frontier home. Family photographs and small treasures from the East adorned the walls and shelves, speaking of a life that had roots deeper than the harsh Arizona territory might suggest. Emily, Mackenzie quickly discovered, had been managing the ranch in Kieran's absence with the help of 2 hired hands. She was as capable and direct as her brother, though with a warmth and social ease that Kieran sometimes lacked. "Kieran wrote that you're quite the markswoman," Emily said as she poured coffee for them in the kitchen. "He said you saved the drive from rustlers twice over." "He exaggerates," Mackenzie demurred. "We all did our part." Kieran shook his head. "I don't exaggerate. Without Mackenzie, we'd have lost half the herd and possibly our lives." Emily studied Mackenzie with new interest. "Well, I for one am glad to finally meet a woman who can hold her own out there. It gets tiresome being the only female in a 50-mile radius who can shoot straight and ride astride. Mackenzie found herself warming to Emily immediately. Here was a kindred spirit, someone who understood the challenges of being a capable woman in a world that often underestimated them. After coffee, Kieran took Mackenzie on a tour of the ranch while Emily prepared dinner. They visited the barn, the corrals, and the bunkhouse where the ranch hands stayed. Everywhere, Mackenzie noted signs of good management and care. The animals were healthy, the facilities well maintained, the land properly tended. "What do you think?" Kieran asked as they stood on a hill overlooking the northern pastures, the setting sun painting the landscape in brilliant oranges and purples. "It's impressive," Mackenzie admitted. "You've built something special here." "My father started it," he corrected her. "I'm just trying to build on his foundation." He turned to face her directly. "But I can do more with the right partner." The intensity in his eyes made her heart skip a beat. "Kieran, you don't have to answer now," he interrupted gently. "Stay a few days. Get to know the place, get to know Emily, then decide." She nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "That seems fair." As they walked back to the house, Mackenzie found herself imagining what it would be like to call this place home. To wake up each morning to these mountains and valleys, to work alongside Kieran and Emily, to have a purpose beyond mere survival. The image was both alluring and terrifying in its permanence. Dinner that night was a lively affair. Emily was an excellent cook, and the food, fresh vegetables from her garden, tender beef, and warm bread, was the best Mackenzie had eaten in months. The conversation flowed easily, with Kieran recounting their adventures on the cattle drive while Emily shared news of the ranch and the surrounding area. "The Wilsons' daughter got married last month," she told Kieran. "And the Hendersons had twins, both boys. Oh, and Judge Parker finally retired. His son took over the circuit." "You've been busy while I was gone," Kieran observed with affection. Emily smiled. "Someone has to keep up with the social obligations. You'd let them all wither on the vine if left to your own devices." Mackenzie watched their easy interaction with a pang of something like envy. Her own family had been small, just her parents and herself. After their deaths, she'd never again experienced the warm certainty of belonging that seemed to exist between these siblings. Later, as Emily cleared the dishes, she asked casually, "Will you be staying in the guest room, Mackenzie? I've already made it up for you." "Thank you," Mackenzie replied, touched by the young woman's thoughtfulness. "Just for a few days while I consider your brother's offer." Emily glanced between Mackenzie and Kieran, a knowing look in her eyes. "Of course, take all the time you need. We're happy to have you here, aren't we, Kieran?" "Very happy," he agreed, his gaze lingering on Mackenzie in a way that made her cheeks warm. That night, in the comfortable guest room with its handmade quilt and curtains that smelled of sunshine, Mackenzie lay awake for a long time. The ranch was seductively peaceful after years of transient living, no wondering where she would sleep next week, no constantly watching her back for threats, no endless search for the next job. But peace came with its own risks. Putting down roots meant creating vulnerabilities, forming attachments that could be severed by fate or human cruelty. She'd protected herself for so long by refusing to form such attachments. Could she really change now? And there was Kieran himself to consider. Mackenzie wasn't naive. She recognized the attraction between them, saw it growing with each day they spent together. If she accepted his business proposition, could she keep their relationship purely professional? Did she even want to? Sleep came slowly, and with it, dreams of a future she'd never allowed herself to imagine. The next few days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Mackenzie rode out with Kieran each morning to check on the cattle and mend fences, learning the boundaries and features of the ranch. In the afternoons, she often found herself helping Emily with various tasks around the house and garden, discovering that the younger woman was as skilled with household management as she was with a rifle or on horseback. On the third day, as they worked together hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Emily broached the subject Mackenzie had been avoiding. "You know, my brother hasn't offered a partnership to anyone since our father died," she said conversationally. He's had offers, men wanting to buy in, promising to expand the operation, but he's always refused. Mackenzie pinned a sheet to the line before responding. Why do you think he offered one to me? Emily paused, a damp shirt in her hands. Because you impressed him, and that's not easy to do. She hung the shirt carefully. Kieran values competence above all else, and loyalty. We were partners for a cattle drive, Mackenzie pointed out. That's different from a permanent arrangement. Is it? Emily gave her a sidelong glance. The principle is the same. Two people working together, trusting each other, sharing risks and rewards. She pinned another garment to the line. Besides, I think there's more to his offer than just business. Mackenzie felt heat rising in her cheeks. What do you mean? Emily smiled knowingly. I've seen how he looks at you, Mackenzie, and how you look at him when you think no one's watching. I don't. Mackenzie began to protest, then stopped herself. Denying the obvious would only insult Emily's intelligence. It's complicated, she said instead. Life usually is, Emily agreed. But sometimes we make it more complicated than it needs to be. She reached for another sheet from the basket. My brother is a good man, stubborn and sometimes too serious for his own good, but good to his core, and lonely, though he'd never admit it. Mackenzie absorbed this in silence, unsure how to respond. Finally, she said, I've been on my own for a long time, Emily. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. Emily's expression softened. None of us are meant to be alone forever, Mackenzie. Not even those of us who have learned to survive that way. She squeezed Mackenzie's arm gently. Just think about it. That afternoon, Kieran took Mackenzie to a part of the ranch she hadn't yet seen, a high meadow where wildflowers grew in profusion, surrounded by tall pines. They dismounted and let their horses graze while they sat on a fallen log, enjoying the view of the valley below. My mother used to bring us here for picnics, Kieran said, his voice softening with memory. She said it was where my father proposed to her, under that big pine. He pointed to a massive tree at the edge of the meadow. It's beautiful, Mackenzie said, understanding why such a place would be chosen for important moments. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the buzzing of insects and the occasional call of a bird. Finally, Kieran turned to her, his expression serious. I know I said you could take your time deciding, and that offer stands, he began, but I need to be honest with you about something, Mackenzie. She tensed slightly, wondering what was coming. Go on. When I first asked you to partner with me on the cattle drive, it was purely practical. I needed someone I could trust, someone with skills. He paused, choosing his words carefully, but it's become more than that for me, much more. Mackenzie's heart began to beat faster, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I'm not just offering you a business partnership anymore, he said quietly, though that still stands if it's all you want, but I find myself hoping for something deeper. His blue eyes met hers steadily. I'm falling in love with you, Mackenzie O'Brien. I think I started falling the moment I saw you outshoot every man in Dry Creek. The words hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Part of Mackenzie had known this was coming, had felt the same pull toward him that he was describing, but hearing it stated so plainly still took her breath away. Kieran, she faltered, unsure how to respond. I don't know if I can be what you want. I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are, he said simply. That's who I'm falling for, the woman who can outshoot any man in 3 territories, who makes her own decisions and stands by them, who shows mercy even when it might be easier not to. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. I'm not asking for an answer today. I just wanted you to know where I stand so you can make your decision with all the facts. Mackenzie looked down at their joined hands, feeling a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. This is all happening so fast, she murmured. Is it? Kieran asked. Sometimes I think we've known each other all our lives, just been waiting to find each other. She looked up at him, struck by the sentiment. It resonated with something deep inside her, a recognition she couldn't explain but couldn't deny either. Slowly, almost uncertainly, she leaned toward him. Kieran remained perfectly still, letting her set the pace. When their lips met, it was soft and brief, a question more than an answer. Mackenzie pulled back slightly, studying his face. What she saw there, the tenderness, the respect, the barely contained joy made her decision for her. She kissed him again, more deeply this time, letting herself explore these new feelings without reservation. When they finally broke apart, Kieran's eyes were shining. "Does this mean you're staying?" he asked, his voice husky. Mackenzie nodded, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "Yes. As your partner in every sense." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I was hoping you'd say that." They rode back to the ranch house as the day was fading, their horses walking close together, their hands occasionally reaching across the space between them to touch, as if reassuring themselves that this new reality was true. Emily was waiting on the porch when they returned, and one look at their faces told her everything she needed to know. Her smile was radiant as she embraced Mackenzie. "Welcome to the family," she whispered. That night, as Mackenzie prepared for bed in what was now to be her room permanently, she felt a strange mixture of emotions, excitement for this new chapter, a lingering trace of fear at the vulnerability she was allowing herself, but above all, a deep sense of rightness. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt as if she had found her place in the world. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Kieran standing there, a small wooden box in his hands. "I wanted to give you something," he said, holding out the box. "It belonged to my mother." Curious, Mackenzie opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a silver brooch in the shape of a star with a small pearl at its center. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It was her favorite piece," Kieran explained. "My father gave it to her on their wedding day. She always said it reminded her of the Arizona sky at night." He hesitated, then added, "I'm not rushing you, Mackenzie. I know we have time to figure out exactly what our partnership will be. But I wanted you to have this as a promise that whatever form it takes, you'll always be my equal. My partner, never my property." Tears pricked at Mackenzie's eyes, tears she would have been ashamed to show just weeks ago, but now felt no need to hide. "Thank you," she whispered, lifting the brooch carefully from its box. "I'll treasure it." Kieran reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray curl from her face. "Good night, Mackenzie." "Good night, Kieran." After he left, Mackenzie stood for a long time by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky over what was now her home. The silver brooch caught the moonlight in her hand, its pearl gleaming like a tiny captured star. For years, she had defined herself by her independence, her ability to survive alone in a harsh world. Now she was choosing a different path, not abandoning her strength, but sharing it, multiplying it through partnership with a man who saw her clearly and valued her for exactly who she was. It wasn't surrender, she realized. It was growth. Over the next few weeks, Mackenzie settled into life at Whispering Pines Ranch. She and Kieran worked side by side during the days, managing the cattle, training horses, and making plans for expanding the operation. Her shooting skills proved useful beyond protecting cattle drives. She became known in the area for her ability to hunt game with remarkable efficiency, bringing in deer and wild turkey that supplemented the ranch's food stores. Emily welcomed her like the sister she'd never had, teaching her the rhythms and routines of ranch life while respecting her need for independence. The three of them formed a family unit that felt natural and right, each contributing their unique strengths to the whole. Word of Mackenzie's shooting prowess spread through the territory, and occasionally men would ride out to the ranch, challenging her to contests or simply wanting to see if the stories were true. Kieran never interfered in these moments, standing back with obvious pride as Mackenzie inevitably demonstrated that the rumors had not been exaggerated. "That's my partner," he would say afterward, his arm around her shoulders. Never my woman or my wife, though their relationship had deepened into something that went beyond business or even friendship. Always partner, equal, respected, cherished for her skills as much as for her heart. 6 months after Mackenzie's arrival at the ranch, Kieran asked her to marry him. They were in the high meadow again, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. He didn't kneel or make flowery speeches, he simply turned to her, took her hands in his, and asked if she would make their partnership official in the eyes of the law and the community. "Nothing would change between us," he assured her. "You'd still be your own woman, free to make your own decisions. I'm just tired of having to explain to nosy neighbors why Miss O'Brien lives at my ranch but isn't Mrs. Zachary." Mackenzie laughed, touched by his understanding of what mattered to her. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll marry you, Kieran, not because I need a husband, but because I want you as my husband." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Emily, the Miller brothers, and a few neighbors as witnesses. Mackenzie wore a simple blue dress that Emily had helped her make, with the silver star brooch pinned over her heart. Kieran wore his best black suit, looking more nervous than he had facing down the Cavendish gang. Judge Parker's son, who had taken over the circuit, performed the ceremony with a knowing smile. He had heard the stories about the sharpshooter who had come to Whispering Pines and changed the life of the reserved rancher who owned it. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," he declared at the end of the simple vows. "Mr. and Mrs. Zachary." "Partners," Kieran whispered as he kissed her for her ears only. "Always," she whispered back. Life settled into a pattern after the wedding, though settled hardly seemed the right word for the vibrant, active existence they shared. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Mackenzie's practical nature complementing Kieran's vision for expansion. They added more cattle, improved the breeding stock, and even began raising horses after Luther Miller came to work for them full-time, bringing his knowledge of horseflesh with him. Emily fell in love with and married the new doctor who came to the growing town nearby, moving out of the ranch house but visiting often. The guest room that had once been Mackenzie's was converted into a nursery when, a year after their wedding, she discovered she was expecting a child. "Are you happy?" Kieran asked her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Her belly was just beginning to swell with their child, and his hand rested protectively over it as she leaned against him. Mackenzie considered the question seriously, as was her way. She thought of the life she had lived before the constant movement, the solitude, the need to prove herself over and over to men who would never truly see her worth. She compared it to now the sense of belonging, the partnership that challenged and fulfilled her, the knowledge that she was valued not despite her strength and independence but because of them. "Yes," she said finally, covering his hand with her own. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Even though you've tied yourself to one place?" he asked, knowing how she had once cherished her freedom to roam. She smiled, turning to look at him in the fading light. "I haven't tied myself to a place, Kieran. I've chosen a home. There's a difference." She squeezed his hand. "And I haven't given up my freedom. I've shared it with someone who makes it more valuable, not less." He kissed her then, a soft, reverent touch that still held the power to make her heart race after all this time. Their daughter, Catherine, was born on a clear spring morning with Emily and the local midwife attending. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's copper hair, and from the beginning she showed signs of the same determined spirit that had brought her parents together. "She'll be shooting before she can walk," Kieran joked as they watched her sleeping in her cradle, tiny fists clenched as if ready to take on the world. "Not before she walks," Mackenzie corrected with a smile, "but maybe right after." 2 years later, they welcomed a son, Daniel, who was quieter than his sister but no less determined. The children grew up in the freedom of the ranch, learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk, following their parents across the land that was their heritage. Mackenzie taught them both to shoot as soon as they were old enough to hold a rifle steady, insisting that girl and boy alike learn the skills that might someday save their lives. "You're raising them to be just like you," Emily observed one day as she watched Mackenzie showing 8-year-old Catherine how to clean her small-caliber rifle. "Is that so bad?" Mackenzie asked, glancing up with a smile. Emily shook her head. "Not at all. The world needs more people who know their own minds and hearts as clearly as you do." She looked thoughtfully at her niece, who was concentrating intently on her task. "Though I pity the young men who will someday come calling on that one." Between her mother's aim and her father's protective instincts, they'll have quite the gauntlet to run, Mackenzie laughed. They'll have to understand she's no one's property, just like her mother. As the years passed, the legend of Mackenzie O'Brien, now Mackenzie Zachary, continued to grow. Stories were told in saloons and around campfires of the woman who could outshoot any man in the territory, who had faced down the notorious Cavendish gang, who had transformed a modest cattle ranch into one of the most successful operations in the region. But those who knew her best understood that her greatest accomplishment wasn't in her marksmanship or her business acumen. It was in the life she had built with Kieran, a partnership of equals that defied the conventions of their time and place. On their 20th anniversary, Kieran took Mackenzie back to the high meadow where he had proposed. They were older now, with strands of silver threading through their hair and lines of experience etched around their eyes. But when he looked at her, he still saw the fierce, independent woman who had captured his heart with a single perfect shot in Dry Creek. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as they sat together on the fallen log that had become their special place over the years. "Settling down with me instead of continuing your adventures," Mackenzie considered him with the directness that had never changed. "Kieran Zachary, living with you has been the greatest adventure of my life," she said simply. "How could I regret that?" He smiled, the years falling away from his face. "I just wanted to be sure. You know you could still ride out tomorrow if you wanted to. I'd wait for you to come back." "I know," she said, touching his cheek gently. "That's why I never need to leave." In the valley below, Whispering Pines Ranch spread out in the afternoon sun, larger now, with more buildings and fields than when she had first seen it, but still beautiful, still home. Their children were grown, Catherine managing much of the ranch operations with her mother's efficiency and her father's vision. Daniel studying medicine in the East, but planning to return to serve the growing community. Mackenzie leaned her head against Kieran's shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had been her anchor through 2 decades of joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. "We built something good here," she murmured. "We did," he agreed, his arm tightening around her. "Together." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors they had witnessed countless times before, Mackenzie reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the lonely, wary sharpshooter who had outshot every man in Dry Creek to the woman she was now still independent, still fierce when needed, but no longer alone. She had found in Kieran not someone who wanted to own or change her, but a true partner who valued her exactly as she was. In doing so, she had discovered that the greatest freedom wasn't in answering to no one, but in choosing to share your life with someone who respected your choices. "Ready to head back?" Kieran asked as the last rays of sunlight faded from the meadow. Mackenzie nodded, rising to her feet and reaching for his hand. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." Hand in hand, they walked back to their horses, partners in every sense of the word, their shared path stretching behind them like a story well told and ahead of them like a promise yet to be fulfilled. In the years that followed, Whispering Pines Ranch became known not just for its cattle and horses, but as a haven for those who didn't fit neatly into society's expectations. Young women who preferred rifles to needlework sought out Mackenzie for guidance. Men who believed in treating women as equals rather than possessions found a kindred spirit in Kieran. Together, they created a legacy that extended far beyond their property lines, a living example that partnerships based on mutual respect and appreciation of each other's strengths could thrive even in the harsh realities of frontier life. And though many stories were told about the legendary sharpshooter and the rancher who had won her heart, the truest one was the simplest. He had seen her skill and said, "Be my partner, not my property." She had recognized the rare value of that offer, and chosen to build a life with a man who cherished her independence as much as he cherished her love. It was, perhaps, the most revolutionary act either of them had ever committed and the most rewarding.